Hi and welcome back to Dusting History. Today I'm working on another image from the State Library of Victoria, and this time I'm going to take a little bit more time and step through the process a little more slowly to hopefully illustrate my work processes. The beautiful thing about this image of the laying of the cornerstone for the Melbourne Town Hall is that there's 3 or 4 copies of the same image held by the library. Now this is the one that I thought was the cleanest of them, and a lot of the others have far more grain. It's exactly the same image, but obviously prints and reprints made of the same time. The only downside to this one is you can see there's some damage in the middle, this kind of white splat in the middle, and it doesn't exist in the other image. As you can see there, when I toggle, that damage in the middle is gone. And you can see this image, the one I was just on, had a lot more grain in it. There in the blacks, you can sort of see there. So I'm preferring to work on the clean one, but what I might do, or what I will do, is actually line the 2 images up so I can get rid of the damage out of the one I want to keep. So half mixing them, you can see the offset. There's not only a translational offset, there's a rotational offset as well, and I'll have to counter that. So what I'll do is I'll go into lining up the 2 images on this guy's nose as a good center point. Close enough. Now by default, Photoshop does not have that center point turned on. It's a preference that you can turn on. I actually like it when I'm translating objects, because what you can do is put that center point on your point of interest, like that guy's nose, and I think holding Control or Alt, it scales around that point. So given that I've lined it up to his nose exactly, I can zoom out to try and look at the guys on the top of the steps on the left there, and then also rotate it till that little guy on the steps sort of resolves and we get a nice sharp line up of his mustache. So tiny bit of distortion difference, but really that's pretty good. So setting that layer back to 100% opacity and then putting a mask in that layer, I can turn that off, and then with a white paintbrush in that layer I can paint through to the image underneath and keep the bits of one image that I like while removing it and replacing it with bits from the other image. Very, very lucky to have this, by the way. Things like that gentleman's arm I just wouldn't have had, and I would have had to use something like generative fill to generate something in place of that damage. Now before I start cleaning, I'm going to add a hue saturation adjustment layer to the top of the list and turn down the saturation so I'm dealing with a black and white image. I find it's always easier to evaluate your levels when you're not looking at something that's sepia coloured. Then with the crop tool, crop away the stuff I don't want. It's amazing how much information's in this. I never noticed those guys out the door there. There's people crammed in everywhere. Now I'll add a curves adjustment layer. You can see there's a lot of greys, but not a lot of blacks, pure blacks, and not a lot of pure whites. You can see how the histogram drops off like that. There's those negative spaces either side. So I'll pull the white down and I'll pull the black up, so that really you can see it gives you a much more high contrast image to work with. And I won't go completely crazy just yet. I can always adjust this later. I'm really just going to play around with the curve a little bit and see how much detail is in the stonework of the building and where I want to set my black and white points. You'll see later I'll push that a lot more aggressively. Also, you can see there's a lot of light leak on the left there. See how it's very pale along the edge? So I'll add another adjustment level, crank it really dark, and put a gradient, just black to white, which is the first option there, and put that there on the side. I always drag it out the wrong way. And then I can go back to the adjustment layer with that live gradient and then start to adjust the black point, the white point. You see I'm pulling around the mid there, which is kind of not right. I actually end up pulling the black and the white up a bit, neutralizing the mid out a little bit. With that done, I'm going to duplicate that layer, and then I'm just going to draw another grad with the same adjustment, but drawing the grading on this side, again, wrong way around, and just fiddle around a bit with the gradient and with the levels adjustment layer until I'm happy with the result. And really all I'm looking for is balance. The good thing with this is it's all still live all the way back down. You know, you can see the original sepia image is still on the bottom layer. So all of this is non-destructive. Okay, so a tiny bit of house cleaning. I'll select those layers and select New Group from Layers from the drop-down menu and call that base. That's just going to be my base grade of the original image. Okay, I've got a brand new layer built on top of everything, and I've selected the remove tool. So now it's time to speed the footage up 2000% and get to all those dots and all that damage. And while the remove tool is fantastic for this kind of work, it's not the only tool I use. Here I'm using a good old clone brush, and I'm cloning from the top column down to the bottom column. So I'm transferring some of the original detail, and it's a really quick cleanup that way. And then of course back to remove tool to keep going. So I swap between clone brush and remove tool when I'm cleaning these things up. Don't think there's been a single one of these images I've ever had that hasn't had a fingerprint like the one I've just cleaned up there. Always some idiot putting their thumb on the print. Who were these people? What did they do for a job? They all look like professors, don't they? And also I'm surprised how many umbrellas, oh look, I really shouldn't be surprised how many umbrellas they have, because it is Melbourne after all, and it does get quite rainy down here. I think it's also funny that so many of these guys are doffing their hats like this guy. Like, you know your photo's been taken, so huzzah, you take your hat off and pose like that. It's great. Now this guy, he's been looking like Luigi to me right from the start. When I come to colour him, I should really give him his own little unique outfit. Alright, so I've selected all those layers, and I'm just going to collapse them down at this point. Not that I need to, but I hate the mess of a long list of layers in the layer stack. So, and look, I do save this often, so it's not a big drama. Now I'm in Topaz Photo AI, and you can see it's discovered a whole bunch of faces here. It's trying to run a sharpening pass on the image. Now I'm going to let it go ahead and do the faces as well. I'm a little gun shy about touching the faces. You know, as much as I'm not trying to create a historical record, I'm just trying to make a lovely image. I still don't like quite what it does to the faces sometimes. So that's done a pretty smart job of filtering a lot of the noise out, like a lot of the grain and stuff, and it's just brought a general sharpness to the image. You can see that lady's face is quite a bit sharper. You can see that, that's quite remarkable. It does sort of flatten them out a little bit. It does destroy a bit of the detail. Who are those kids? Who invited them? But see, look at that boy in the hat there. Look at his face. He looks positively, I don't know, drunk or something. So yeah, it's not my favourite thing in the world. Anyway, so I'll bring the topaz layer in and do what I normally do, which is actually not commit to it, just commit partially to it. So looking around, it's done a great job, but it's a bit smooth, a bit flat looking. So as you can see, I'm just mixing it in gently, and I think a gentle touch here is really what you need. You really sort of zoom out and you get a sense of the crispness, but you're not really overdoing that AI look and face thing. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a great tool, but I'm just not the kind of guy that likes too much of that stuff. Alright, so I'll merge that down. I have saved. I can always go back to what I had. Now into this thing, palette.fm. This is a fantastic app. I've subscribed to this. I think it's great. As you can see up the top, it's generated a base palette. And then across the top, you've got all these different ones you can select. So I'm going to kick a bunch off. These are my favorites. The Faded Elegance, the Outdoor Vibes one are great. So you can see here, if I flick between them, they all sort of generate different palettes for the scene. And what I'm not looking for so much are the people, because I'm going to go through and paint all of them individually, but just the environment, and particularly that sandstone block in the foreground. You see this version here, the Outdoor Vibes one, it's got a beautiful blue on the top, like the sky dome is reflecting on that stone. So I've downloaded that in high definition, and the other two I'm going to download with the middle button, which brings them in small definition. So you pay for the high definition ones. So you can see the high definition one stamps straight on top, which is fantastic. And it's a really, really good basis. Like, there's a lot that's wrong with it, but gee, it's a really compelling base to paint with. So I'll drop the other two in. You can see how tiny they are in the center there. And then I'm going to resize them up large to fit the screen or the image. Now I'll scale those up, and as expected, they're going to be very, very low resolution. But when you set your layers to color mode, they only show their colors, and the sharpness comes from the black and white image underneath. So whilst they're a little blurrier than the HD version, they're still very useful. So at this point, I'll spend a bit of time looking between the three choices and just seeing what parts of them I want to keep, what parts I want to throw away. I really like the sense of sky dome in that outdoor one, that sense of feeling the blue sky reflected on shiny objects or flat surfaces. So I'll set a vibrance adjustment layer there and just boost the vibrance of the image a bit, because I think the palettes are great, but quite often they're a little low-key, they're a bit muted feeling, and I'm trying to replicate a more modern photograph. So adding a mask to that layer, I can start to paint through with a white paintbrush and actually take, just take some of the colors from the low res palette that I liked. And I'm not trying to be too detailed here with my edges. You can see I'm brushing really quickly. I'm trying to find a color balance for the image. So I'm trying to find, some of these outfits pop a little bit too bright, some of it's too blue. There's a ton of blue there, and reds and purples, and I'm going to try and pull them in to line a little bit. I do want to keep some of those nice colors because, the past wasn't all black and white, but I don't want it all to be too razzle-dazzle. So I'm really just finding my feet before I really dig in. So I've got a fairly long way to go, but this is at least a good launching point now. I'm kind of happy with where this is. Actually, in hindsight, I think I go a little too hard on the purples. So there's a bit I didn't film later on where I actually pulled a lot of the purples out of a lot of the outfits of the people. Now I've added another levels adjustment layer here. There's something to be said for adjusting levels with once you have a little color down. You get to sort of look at the image more like a color photograph, and you can balance it up a tiny bit more. Now I will move this level down later so that it's on the black and white image and then the color sits on top, but because of the way the color filter works, it doesn't really matter where that is on the chain. Now here's a happy snap of some people I found online, a Creative Commons copyright free image, and they're standing in front of a sort of a sandstone building. And what's really great is look at the steps by the people, how there's so much blue on the top and then warm color on the front face. And that's kind of what attracted me to that palette of the sandstone block in the foreground, and also what I'll be attempting to do with the building in the background, trying to put some of that bluer tone in the shadow and then that sandstone color on the front faces. Alright, so now I've got my basic palette, I can start painting. And you'll see what I'm doing is I'm really working on the clothing first. I'm actually not going to worry about the hands and faces because that's going to be a whole separate pass later. And whilst I'm concentrating on the clothing, if I see some piece of wood or a little support that's too blue or the wrong color, I'll just fix that as I go. I think the best time to do something is when you actually see it, rather than try to remember to come back later when it's this complicated. I don't know if any of you have ever watched The Great, but that lanky guy with the lamb chops there that I'm painting right now, he just reminds me of Archie. You can see I'm trying different things. I tried buttons on that guy, they were a little bit green. I tried some sort of copper buttons or silver looking buttons. A lot of people are wearing fob chains, and so putting those little hints of yellow on the chain, trying also not to make them just flat yellow, but to allow the highlights to be paler or whiter, like they're reflecting more of the sky. Also, you can see those top hats. They look really great when you add a tiny bit of blue along the shimmery edge of it. Adds a real pop of colour. I was in two minds here whether people should have different coloured pants to their suits. I worried that if I just made them all exactly the same colour, you know, like jacket to pants, which is probably more accurate, I felt that the image would just look a little bland and they'd look very monochrome or mono-coloured, you know, like not interesting. So I've kind of maybe taken a bit of artistic license there. I love sort of picking out little details like this walking cane and trying to make it feel not too brand new, not too coppery, but just sort of, you know, a few different tones in there, some warmer tones, some cooler tones. I kind of find a really complex little palette like that of mixing up more than one colour on the top is really great. I'll work, you know, I guess if you look up at my paintbrush up the top, you'll see that the opacity is changing up and down as I work, and I tend to paint a little bit at 100% opacity or 50%. I'll put a little bit of a mix of colour together and literally mix on the picture. And then when I'm really happy with that colour, I'll sample it, put the opacity up to 100 and paint with that colour. You can see with this guy, if I paint the same color all over him like I'm doing there, it looks kind of flat. See how the dark side's gotten really rich? So what I'll tend to do is select that same color and then mute it down a little bit, pull it towards a grayer tone, and then fill that into the shadow area. Also that guy's shoulder, see I've left a little bit of that bluish tone in his shoulder there. That sort of blueness sort of suggests the sky dome again. As you can see, I've dragged in some reference of clothing of the era, just to make sure I'm not straying too far from the brief. And as with the men, for the women I've brought in some reference as well. This woman here in that sort of olivey top there, I've tried to make it complex. See how it looks really flat. So by putting some different kind of warmer browns and some more muted grayer tones of the same color, and then some like little suggestions of greener flowers and with little red centers, I've tried to make it more Victorian and a little bit more embroidered looking. But ultimately that olive color really annoyed me. So I went, you'll see, I'll change it later. Now this is a good example of the sky dome contribution. I've put some brown on this woman's hand to signify kind of gloves, but there you can see in the highlight, I'm just trying to cool it off a little bit, make it just that tiny bit steely blue, just to suggest that the shine is reflected of the sky rather than just another lighter version of the same brown. And it really just gives a dynamic to the color palette. And on this woman's dress, I'm using two sorts of lilac. I'm using a kind of a bluer one for the front faces, for the top of her breast and down her arm and on her pelvis. But then I'm using a richer purple, particularly in the shadow areas and sort of further down where the dress plunges into the back of the guy in front of her. Now this here is really great. I was really happy with this. You see the girl in the bright blue. Some of the blue of her outfit is bouncing onto the green back of the woman with her back turned to us. And I just want to take a moment to explain why I do that with a little bit of blender. There you go, something different. So here's a red ball on a yellow surface, and what you can see if you look is the red ball reflects some of its red into the shadow and onto the ground, and also casts out in front where the bright light hits it. Similarly, the yellow bounces up onto the ball. So there's not just red ball and yellow, there's a whole lot of complex colors going on. And see, there's not much blue in that shadow, but as we turn to an angle, the blue from the sky dome starts to really show up. And particularly if an object's chrome or shiny like this ball, you get a real, what's called a Fresnel reflection, where you get more of that blue of the sky becoming apparent on on the top of the shiny surface. Alright, lesson over. So you can see I'm always looking for opportunities where sunlight is hitting something really hard and throwing its colour forward into the shadow area of another object, or when the sky dome contributes either a reflection or into the shadows of an object. So that's why I think it sort of pays to be a tiny bit loose with the painting. I am being very, very careful with a lot of the edges and things, but I am trying to introduce variation in the colour. All these guys look pretty ghostly. I'm going to get to all their faces soon enough. You can see that woman in the purple. I've tried to indicate by hand all those little golden dots, like she's got something embroidered on her outfit. A lot of bling here today. Okay, so the woman in the olive, I've had enough of her, so what I'm going to do here is just really quickly paint a flat colour. Really doesn't matter what colour it is. It's not particularly opaque, but it's on a separate layer. And then I'm going to set it to colour, and then add a hue saturation layer that is constrained to that red. And then zooming out wide, I'm just going to pull the hue slider around and the saturation slider and see if I can find a colour that's not that horrible olive colour that sort of fits with the composition. It's a really quick way just to spin the wheels and see what options there are. So I settled on this kind of rusty red colour, and now I'm just going to go through and paint that more onto her hat and paint it around, maybe modify some of the colours a little bit and just try to blend it in a little, take a little bit more care painting the edges. So I think it's starting to look pretty interesting. Now to turn my attention to the wood and to the stone. And again, reference is really great. So another image, and I've just been sampling directly from it, like I did with the costumes, using it to sort of inform the dirt and inform the color of the side of the stone when it's in shadow. I am sort of kicking a bunch of wooden kind of ready colours back up under that awning there. I think that really helps, pulls it forward. This is an ideal time just to scour the image and look for any of those points where a tiny bit of the staircase is showing through. There's always a little bit that you've missed that you'll stumble across later. Okay, sort of referring back to what I was talking about with that blender thing with the ball on the plane, you can see I'm selecting some blue and putting that in the shadow of the sandstone, and then going through and putting some warmer tones on the flat faces. So you can see under the window arches there's that sort of lovely muted blue colour, and then there's that sort of more yellow colour in front. Okay, onto the faces. This is where things really pop. So I've picked this happy smiling group, and what I'm doing on a separate layer, just in flat colour, is trying to find the zones of colour. So you're going to have the paler colour where the sun's hitting, you're going to have that red of the cheeks and the nose and the ears. There's that line of darker red across the center, and then the color of the shaded side of the light of their faces. And what I've tried to do is find a photo where people are lit in a similar way to the people in the image I'm working on. Now on the layer below it, you can see I've set that to color, and I'm starting to paint on the characters in the frame, and you can see straight up that looks really, really red on that guy's face. But once I've started to blend those colors together, and once I start to knock some of that intense red out of the shadow side of him, and you'll see in a sec I'll pick a more muted tone for the shadow side, it starts to sit together well. So I'm not happy with how beetrooty that side of his face is. So I'm going to sample a grayer tone off the people from this guy. Use that as a bit of a knockdown of the bright sort of pink on the side of the face. And then I'm going to put some of that mid-tone down. I'm going to pick a grey and then sort of half paint some grey on top, like that. And that's going to become the basis for their chin, their sort of stubbly chins. You can see just adding that to that guy's added a ton of complexity to his colour palette. Now I'm going to try it on a few more faces. It's interesting, I guess it's indicative of Australia at the time, but there is it's pretty much just white guys. So yeah, this one palette's going to do me pretty well. It is a little too colourful, so I'm putting a little vibrance adjustment there, and I'm just going to knock it down a touch and then collapse those layers down so they've had that vibrancy baked in, so they're not quite as punchy as that photo of those people. So now that I have that formula sorted, it's just a matter of rolling it out onto every single face. I'm also noticing that there are a ton of hands, and hands are going to need a slightly different palette. So I sort of set another little circle there of a sort of a slightly more yellow skin color and then a slightly warmer tone. Hands are always weird. I think they're like how you have that red zone across the cheeks and nose and the ears on a face. On hands you tend to have slightly more red tips of fingers. So I have those two colors, one for the main arm and the hand itself, and then one slightly warmer tone for the fingertips. So you can see that sort of cooler shadow side of the face coupled with the slightly warmer right hand side of the face really makes quite a photographic kind of look. And every single time it looks like it's too red when you put the first colour down, but by the time you've modulated it with some of these other tones, it sort of comes good. And I'm not stressing too much about beard colour. I'm pretty much sampling colours from other people's jackets and their vests and wherever else just to make the colours. I am actually, although, trying to keep that slight kind of brownness just around the mouth, kind of like a nicotine stained beard, beard like their soul patch, and introducing more sort of flat grey tones for the other areas. Does that sort of balding guy on the right look like a philosopher or like Jung or one of those kind of guys? I don't know. I find it incredible how quickly people really jump to life once you put a bit of this colour into them. Flush their cheeks with a little pink, and even this guy, old Archie here, he sort of comes up okay. He was looking like death warmed up for most of the time. In fact, some of these people really don't look like they're from the era, and I don't even know what that means, but maybe it's just the way they've groomed themselves or the way they're looking at the lens. Some of them look out at you and they look incredibly contemporary. One last little thing I like to do is something that happens with skin and things with translucency like that. Here's a little example in Blender, and you can see where the shadow terminates between the bright sun and the shadow. It gets quite red on the rim there, and that happens with skin as well because the shadow's penetrating through the skin and kind of glowing on that edge. And so I like to get like a slightly redder brush and just work my way around any time I see one of those really hard lines of shadow and putting a tiny bit of that rich red in there, and it just really helps the image. You can see I'll work through everybody with a hard shadow and just put that faint little line in. So now I'm having a little fiddle with the hands. You can sort of see I'm just putting that one colour down and then working away on the tips of the fingers and making them just that tiny bit redder. Very close to coming to the end of this little exercise today. This is 4 or 5 hours work, I think, condensed down. So here's the original, if you remember it. The black and white, which I always keep, of course. And my attempted colour. A lot of painting, but hopefully worth the effort. So as usual, thank you so much. We'll see you next time.